Okay, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, even though I've discovered that you have the same wonderful weather here as we do in the UK at the moment. I want to start by thanking our hosts, Experimental Finland. We've been following your work, building both a culture of experimentation and testing policy, and it's setting a real international example. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about why we need to experiment. So what experimental government is, why it matters, and what kinds of policy and social problems we can use experimentation to help us solve. Before that, I'm going to introduce the Alliance for Useful Evidence and give you some information about our context in the UK. So the Alliance for Useful Evidence is a network. We're hosted by Nesta, who are the UK's Innovation Foundation. We're a UK-wide organisation, so we have staff in Wales and Scotland and hopefully soon Northern Ireland. Our network is made up, as you can see, of non-governmental bodies like charities and social enterprises, also government, the UK's What Works centres, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and also research organisations, so universities, research councils and funders. So the work that we do with our network is quite varied. With charities, for example, we're working with them to help them use evidence better in their campaigns. And with government, we deliver training to our civil service, helping them to use research evidence better in their day-to-day jobs. So we've published on lots of different aspects of evidence and policy making, so from kind of future directions for scientific advice through to social media and public policy. So our aim really is to make university research and our own work freely available, accessible and relevant for everyone. So we support the UK What Works network, which was launched in 2013 at Nesta. There are now 7 What Works centres in England and 2 affiliated centres in Wales and Scotland. The What Works centres have had some really huge successes. So, for example, the Education Endowment Foundation has more than doubled the amount of evidence we have available about education. They've funded over 160 randomized control trials in over a third of English schools. So I'm not going to say too much about what the What Works centres do, but this slide just shows really the range of their work. So they do things from kind of producing their own primary evidence to synthesizing existing evidence, translating that into something that's useful for practice, disseminating, and then working with professionals in implementing evidence and evaluating. And it's this kind of last side of the cycle that we are particularly working on at the moment in a new What Works Centre for Children's Social Care that we're currently incubating. So we set that up last year, and we're working with social care professionals and with various aspects of government to set up that evidence hub and kind of design it and think about how it can be most useful. So as this slide says, we are champions of What Works, and we have a role advising evidence centres and hubs across the UK. So here is a roadmap for my talk today. I'm going to start by asking what is experimentation and just kind of clarifying what we mean when we talk about experiments. Then I'm going to look at why we need it. I'm going to really quickly run through 4 kinds of experiments before lastly looking at when they are useful and why they matter. So I'm going to start by posing a problem. This actually is not a problem posed by me. It's a problem posed by Chris Grayling, who is the UK's current Secretary of State for Transport. When he said this, he was actually Secretary for Criminal Justice. It's quite a long quote, but I'll read it. He said, "The last government were obsessed by pilots. Sometimes in government, we just have to believe in something and do it. But the last government set out a pilot timetable under which it would have taken about 8 years to get from the beginning of the process to evaluation and beyond. Sometimes we have to believe something is right and do it." Now, I'm not a massive fan of Chris Grayling, but I think he expressed here a fairly common frustration with policy experimentation that I want to pick up on. So he touches on the issue that evidence can be really slow, and also on this idea of belief and government needing to act on belief. So I'm going to argue in this talk that experiments are not only an essential part of the evidence base that government needs to be intelligent and well-informed, but also that experiments help us to solve problems more efficiently. So why do we need experiments, and how can they make decision-making more effective? So experimentation, experiments, experimental are words that we hear a lot. They're being used a lot in the UK at the moment in many different ways. So I think it's useful to be really clear what we talk about when we mean experimentation. And we at the Alliance for Useful Evidence, we find it useful to go back to a dictionary definition of an experiment. So a test or an investigation, especially when one planned for or against a hypothesis. I think this tells us two important things about experiments. Firstly, like a test or an investigation, an experiment has a structure. It's a systematic process that allows us to learn. Secondly, experiments generate evidence, new information that can be used in decision-making. I think it also tells us something important about what experimentation is not. Experimentation isn't very useful when it just tries something out with nothing in place to learn. So in this publication, Better Public Services Through Experimental Government, we made the case that if we want effective public services, we need an experimental learning government, robustly and systematically testing things out, measuring them and growing what works. This definitely isn't a new idea. So this is an image of American President Franklin Roosevelt, who was famously called the Great Experimenter. So in the 1930s and 40s, he argued for bold and persistent experimentation. During his presidency, 8,000 social scientists were hired by the US government who tested the policies and programs of the New Deal. This history definitely isn't unique to the US. So, for example, in Mexico, an anti-poverty cash transfer scheme that was really rigorously evaluated has kind of stood the test and managed to survive through several changes in government. I'm going to give 5 reasons why we need to experiment, and also why it's really, really important today. So the first is that I think at the moment we desperately need policy that is informed by good evidence and not by ideology. I'm not going to labour this point too much. Many parts of the world are going through a period of increasing political polarisation. We're facing a more unstable international situation than we have done in a while, and we also face some really existential threats, so threats to our environment and the ecologies in which our societies can thrive. If anyone needs convincing of the crucial role of evidence in protecting democracy, please come to the UK, where we were told that £350 million saved from leaving the EU would be reinvested in our health service. Of course, we've since discovered that it won't be and it doesn't exist. So evidence is, of course, only part of the picture in decision-making. It's really important that politicians and policymakers use their values and use their judgment in government. But policy that is based on no evidence at all really risks being guesswork. High-quality evidence can also change people's minds. It can persuade people, lead to better decisions, and maybe one day it will even win elections. So I would argue as well that government has an ethical duty to put policy to the test. So in the UK, in 2013, £66 billion of government money was spent on projects that had no plans to evaluate them. That's a huge amount of public money spent with little credible evidence about what works. In effect, I think this means that the government are already experimenting on huge numbers of the population by rolling out untested policy nationally without understanding the effects it's having in the world. So testing policy is really important because our intuitive ideas of what works aren't always right. This is a really famous example from America. It's a film poster, a documentary about a US social program called Scared Straight. And in this social program, American school children were taken to US prisons to meet offenders and to kind of see, what happens if you commit crime. It was really, really famous in the US, it was really popular in the media, and it was kind of replicated across Europe, including in the UK. But a randomized evaluation showed that it actually had harmful effects. So instead of, in several areas, instead of reducing crime, it was actually increasing it because students were kind of going and somehow it was glamorizing crime. So the problem is that our really well-intentioned ideas sometimes may not have the effect we want them to. So this is another example. It's a graph from an American child development program that was providing home visits for mothers in poverty when they had their first child. And this graph looks like a pretty great success. So this is the percentage of mothers in employment. And over time, it's rising from about 16% to around 40%. Or at least that's what a kind of less rigorous evaluation method would tell us. But this was actually a randomized control trial, and this dotted line we have here is the control group who weren't receiving the intervention. They're rising the same from about 16 to 40. So in the area of employment, at least, this program wasn't really having the effect that it had hoped to. So this is a really big challenge because there are still many people in charities as well as journalists and in policymaking who are still happy to claim this black line as a success. And I think the willingness to take a learning approach is really the third reason why we need experiments. So if we don't use rigorous methods, and if we aren't really willing to take an honest look at our programs and policies, we can't be confident they're having the effect we want in the world, or that we are spending money wisely. Actually, there's many organizations now working to more robustly and also flexibly test innovations. So here are some examples from across the world. I have a feeling some of them may have already been talked about. But we have the Behavioural Insights team in the UK, the Behavioural Insights Network in Holland, Embed at the World Bank, and MindLab in Peru, just as some examples. And there's work being done in these organisations to take a more flexible and adaptive approach to government. They're really seizing opportunities to learn and experiment. And actually, they're showing how possible it is for this to be done at scale. These are low-cost experiments using existing data. So the internet and the advent of kind of big data is really giving us many more opportunities to test and to learn. We're no longer constrained by having to kind of go out and experiment with people in the field. We can experiment with kind of existing resources at low cost. And another reason to take a more adaptive approach is to be much more responsive to the needs of citizens. So we need to understand better what works for service users and also for professionals working at the front line. So some new institutions of experimentation are kind of working towards this more collaborative way of solving problems. So in the UK, we have our cross-government trials advice panel, which brings together teams of experts from universities and from the civil service to work together to support government to test policy. And actually, the 3 levels of experimentation that Experimental Finland is working with are really, really instructive here in this kind of cross-cutting approach. So I think we need experiments at the strategic level, at the level of partnerships, at programs, and also at the grassroots. And some of these kind of new organizations we're setting up have the ability to kind of bring those things together. I think it's that really cross-cutting work that is going to help us confront complexity and tackle wicked problems. So we're facing more and more intractable policy problems, more pressures on public services, and increasingly complex social issues. And there are now a range of different experiments being used to shed light on these policy areas. So there's 2 examples here. The first is from the UK, the Integrated Communities English Language Learning Programme. And this was one government department, the Ministry of Housing and Communities, their first ever randomized trial. And it was a waitlist trial that found that English language training had a positive effect on new arrivals in the country, ability to kind of form friendships and make new relationships in the community. And that's the first time that we have this kind of evidence that that's effective. Over on the right here is a really interesting American program from an organization called Frontiers of Innovation at the US Center, Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And they're using rapid cycle experiments, which I'll talk about later, to innovate in really complex areas. So this project, Ready for Routines, helps families create routines in order to improve executive mental function in parents. So they're actually basing this in really interesting neuroscientific research. So what we're learning, I think, increasingly, is that policy that is developed on paper and not tested often really struggles to meet the challenges of complex social problems on the ground. Experiments give us a really great toolbox for testing and developing policy in the real world. So working in the real world always has its downsides. Testing and learning means that failure is not only possible, it's also likely. But if we're experimenting well, then that's okay. So experimentation is not about taking big, uncalculated risks. It's about starting small and so reducing our risk. It's about having more early failures for fewer later failures, being innovative and cautious at the same time, and testing policy before it's rolled out at scale. We actually have a really sad example of how not to experiment in the UK. So this is universal credit, which is a new social security benefit system that was announced in 2010 and was actually piloted in 2013 in, I think, 2 or 3 councils. And initial results from the pilots were really worrying. So there was reports that in some councils it had increased the use of food banks by up to 97%. Earlier this year, a report by the National Office of Statistics concluded that the system did not offer value for money now and that it probably wouldn't in the future. Last month, a report was leaked that said there was no evidence that one of its kind of key mechanisms, benefit sanctions, actually worked. So I think this is a really clear example of a government kind of over-investing in an untested policy and not being able or willing to back out in the face of evidence that it wasn't effective. So before this was even trialled, it was called a one-in-many-generations reform, and billions of pounds were spent on new IT infrastructure before we even understood the impact it was having. So one of the key principles of kind of good experimentation, I think, is humility and being humble. And there's no one better to teach us that than Yoda, obviously. So failure is a really great teacher. Experimenting does mean being humble. It means accepting that good ideas are never born fully formed. And we have to also accept that that really isn't easy. So there are some areas of government where failure is really sensitive, and across the board, really, for everyone, this is about culture change, and it takes a lot of work. So I'm going to really quickly run through 4 types of experiments. I think you may have already heard about a couple of these today, so I'll go fairly quickly in this bit. Firstly, randomized control trials, I expect you're all familiar with. They are the most robust way that we have of estimating impact and learning what works. They have a really simple design where people are randomly allocated to a control group to receive the program, an intervention group to receive a program or a control group. And we can measure differences in outcomes. It's worth saying that there are different ways of designing these to be sensitive to different contexts. So if we don't want to deny people a potentially valuable intervention, we can use a design that kind of rolls policy out slowly and allows everyone to get the intervention in the end if it's been, looks promising once it's tested. So increasingly, RCTs are being used in a huge range of policy areas across the world. So we have, in France, the Experimental Youth Fund is looking at kind of small-scale solutions to poverty. Then we have, for example, JPAL, the World Bank, and Oxfam, who've been experimenting in the area of international development. RCTs tend to be a bit like Marmite. People either really love them or hate them. In the UK, there tends to be quite kind of polarized discussion around them. They're increasingly flexible, though, so I think while they're only one piece of the puzzle, many criticisms of them are now less relevant. So I think this is quite a good example, this organ donation trial. This was one of the largest ever trials run in the UK, and it looked at whether different online messages would encourage people to join the National Organ Donor Register. This had a sample of over 1 million people and only cost £20,000, which is sort of relatively cheap. So this was actually a type of RCT called an A/B test. So an A/B test uses an RCT to test tweaks in design or implementation, often online. It's a really simple way of finding out what users prefer, and it's done in business all the time. So any time that we visit the Google homepage, we're actually seeing an experiment. So A/B tests are a really good example of the kind of many ways in which we can use randomized trials. This is a slide that I've stolen from some colleagues at the Innovation Growth Lab at Nesta, because I think it's great. So it moves really from the kind of what is the problem area of experimentation right through to what works, and from really simple, small-scale questions through to much more kind of large-scale, complex questions. So when randomization isn't possible, we still have lots of robust ways of estimating impact. So quasi-experimental designs, they tend to be a little bit overlooked, probably because they have super sexy names like regression discontinuity design, but they're actually really, really useful. Most of them, or the majority of them, work by using kind of statistical methods to create comparison groups. Thirdly, we have rapid cycle testing. This is an area of experimentation which is relatively new and I think really exciting. So rapid cycle testing is focused on local problem solving. It can be used to improve the way a service is being delivered or adapt an idea or an intervention to a new local context. It's a cyclical method which involves everyone who is delivering and evaluating a service or project working together to implement and test small changes. So this model is actually from the Family Nurse Partnership in the UK. The Family Nurse Partnership was an evidence-based program brought over to England from America. It has a huge amount of strong evidence behind it, so it's been found to have really positive effects in multiple RCTs in multiple countries. But when it was tested in the UK, it was found that it wasn't working. Instead of just kind of chucking it out, the team are working with an organization called the Dartington Service Design Lab to use a new method which they're calling ADAPT, which stands for Accelerated Design and Program Testing. And this is really aiming to adapt an evidence-based intervention to meet the needs of users and communities in the UK. And I think there's hope in the future that we can start to use methods like RCTs in conjunction with this to kind of evaluate them a bit more rigorously. So another way of experimenting is to kind of use design approaches to experimentally prototyping innovations and new solutions. These approaches are often user-centered, human-centered, and they aim to generate a better fit between providers and users. So this graph is from a publication that Nesta did with IDEO on designing for public services. And that really shows the development from a kind of concept-level prototype through to a feels-like prototype and a works-like prototype. Nesta sums this up as the space of the unobvious. And I think that why some of these early-stage experiments are really, really useful is because they encourage us to create more possible solutions to problems that we face, rather than sticking with the status quo. So the reason for kind of looking at all of these different methods is to get a better sense of how experiments are useful and why they matter in decision-making. Experiments can help us to answer a growing number of different questions in policy, in practice, and in programs. As with any research or evaluation tool, we should always start from the question or the problem at hand. So the method we use should follow the problem and the question and the situation that we're in. So these are just some of the kind of examples of different questions that experiments are helping us to answer. And I think that the kind of range of questions that are here are really growing. So we have this kind of early stage concept development stuff about how can I develop my idea, through to can I make this work better for users? Is this project worth scaling? And we also have some kinds of questions that perhaps we don't commonly associate with kind of big experiments like RCTs. So this is a matrix. It's way too much information for a PowerPoint slide, I'm sorry. Really, this is just to communicate that certain methods are suited to answering certain kinds of questions. So here, on the right, we have a kind of list of different policy and practice questions, and you can kind of go across and see which method is most suitable. And this is actually part of a resource that we're developing to help organizations and public services choose and run the best kind of experiment for them. So I kind of want to return now to why this all matters and why it's important. So I think in the long term, single one-off experiments aren't an end. What we really need is a kind of robust and flexible knowledge base about what works and why. For that, we need many experiments, and we also need replicated experiments. So this is a diagram of the process of conducting a systematic review. A systematic review is a way of bringing together all of the research in one field, often from randomized trials, but also from other sources. It's a process that starts with reviewing existing research. Evidence is then collected and refined. Each individual study is scored on the basis of its robustness. And then conclusions can be drawn about what's most effective in the field as a whole. And that's the kind of work that some of the What Works centres in the UK are doing at the moment. So I'm going to kind of wrap up now with a few thoughts on why experimental government matters. And I'm going to return to this quote from Chris Grayling and his frustration with pilots. So I think we can kind of take issue with him on two accounts. Some experiments now allow us to see results much quicker than 8 years. When we do need to wait years for the results of the pilot, that's because long-term policy outcomes can take time to emerge, and it's right that we invest about learning in them. Secondly, I think he's got it wrong that we should just believe in things and then do them. I think it makes much more sense to believe in things and then test them. And this is why work around experimental culture is so valuable. So running experiments like randomized trials are the most robust way we have to understand the difference we're making in the world. Trials and other experimental methods like rapid testing and prototyping are some of the most effective ways to create better feedback loops between services and citizens and of solving problems on the ground. So the change that we want to see in the world really is this shift from kind of traditional policy making through to smarter, more experimental policy making. This means being as scientific as possible in exploring a greater range of solutions, starting small, growing and testing what works, being responsive to the needs of citizens so that our democracy is bolstered, and building a robust evidence base for policy. Okay, thank you.